Yeah. Now I'm panicking.
Yeah, don't panic.
No, I am, because I'm going to lose my job.
So it's a good chance you came here for one or two reasons. You're an MCU fan and you came here prepared for war, or you're a DC fan that came here to hear somebody dump on the MCU. Whichever camp you fall into, let me save you just a little bit of trouble. I am a bigger fan of DC's source material, but when it comes to things being adapted to screen, I've been a fan of both DC and Marvel. Iron Man 1, Captain America Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy, Avengers Infinity War, just to name a few, are some of my favorite movies ever, regardless of genre. So this isn't a video made to bash the MCU or its fandom, but
always a but.
I've noticed a pretty big shift in mindset of what makes a good movie ever since the success of the MCU. There's so many people that live and die by the MCU formula so much that it shapes their entire opinion on what makes a movie good, regardless of what genre it falls into. And to be honest, it's a little bit heartbreaking, but before we get into why it's so heartbreaking, let's talk about this MCU formula for a bit. Whether it's being talked about with love and reverence, or being talked about as being stale and played out, you more than likely have heard of the MCU formula. For the most part, it's worked pretty seamlessly for nearly 15 years. It's a very extensive outline that I don't really have the time or want to go in depth on, but I'm gonna try to simplify it the best I can. So Act 1, we're basically setting up the world, and they're gonna give us a little taste of the tone by introducing a character flaw, and at the end of Act 1, we get a little bit of action and comedy to tide us over until the plot starts. Because when we get to Act 2, it's gonna be a pretty big exposition dump setting up the plot. Act 2 usually starts with people just talking and having a conversation, giving us some insight on what the hero is going to be up against. The hero, of course, is going to show some resistance, but gets propelled into the plot because something happens that they can't ignore. Around this time is where we usually meet the villain for the first time, and eventually their plan unfolds. We get rewarded with a little bit more action for sitting through all the exposition, and at the end of that action sequence, there's usually a twist that the hero doesn't see coming to end Act 2. Act 3 starts with our hero down and depressed for a few minutes, but they get some sort of pick-me-up or pep talk that gets them going and ready for the big final battle. We get a little anticipation leading into that final battle. The final battle happens, the hero wins, all of the loose ends in the film are wrapped up, and the movie is over. We get a mid or end credit scene setting up the next movie. Make sure you sprinkle in a lot of quips and one-liners to follow the more serious beats in the film, and you got yourself an MCU movie. And yes, I know that is a very, very oversimplified version of the Marvel formula. If you care to see it broken down in its entirety, the best video on it I've seen is Dissecting the Marvel Formula by Caleb Gammon. I'll leave a link to his video in the description. After you finish mine, you should go check his out. But like I said, people viewing every movie under that lens is very heartbreaking because for the most part, most MCU films fall under one category or genre of film. Not all of them, but most. Yes, you can argue that the Tom Holland Spider-Man flicks or teen dramas or coming of age comedies or even rom-coms. You could argue that Guardians of the Galaxy is technically sci-fi or the first Thor movie is mythology. And on the surface, I would agree with you for the most part, but at the core, they all have the same exact structure and setup and delivery. For the most part, they're all action-adventure comedies. Some have more comedy than others, but action-adventure comedies nonetheless. Movies like Thor Ragnarok juggle some pretty heavy, intense topics, but you don't leave the movie feeling that heavy weight and tragedy. You leave thinking that was funny as hell and the action was dope. We've been told since she's been introduced that Black Widow is this very dark, morally gray person with a very heavy, jaded, and shady past, but we never really get to see it to the point where I can't speak for anyone else, but for me, I just don't really buy that this character is as dark, shady, and morally gray as I'm being told that she is or was. They haven't really shown me anything to make me feel that. Same thing with Shang-Chi. We're told in the film that he basically was a trained assassin that has killed people before as a child. We don't really see him deal with any of the traumas that would come along with being a child assassin. But I will give credit when credit is due. The MCU series have been dealing pretty heavily on the negative aspects of what having heroes in the world would cause, as well as just the negative aspects of those heroes' life. So hats off to them for that. But in the films, it just hasn't been shown very often. Because honestly, these movies weren't made to make us feel those type of things. At the end of the day, these are all made to be feel-good movies. Up until the point of maybe Spider-Man Homecoming, you weren't made to think about any of those things like the damage and repercussions of the previous Avengers movies. Up until that point, they were pretty much pure escapism. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with that. Sometimes I just want to watch a superhero movie and escape. But I find it pretty interesting that now that Phase 4 has taken a deeper dive into things like that it's been a lot less well received than the previous 3 phases. But that's a topic for another video. Ever since probably 2012 and the success of the Avengers film, anytime a superhero flick comes out and it's not bright and bubbly and full of jokes, I've seen that be used as an actual critique of the film. Let me say that again. A lack of jokes has been used as a critique on a film regardless of what genre it falls into, whether it be casual fans or people who are actually paid to give their reviews on movies. And once again, there is nothing wrong with the quippy nature of most MCU films, but it's almost as if people don't understand or appreciate situational humor anymore due to the popularization of verbal humor from most MCU movies. I just recently watched the film The Batman. There were a lot of hilarious moments in there due to the situation, not necessarily the jokes and what was being said, but there were a lot of funny situations. And this isn't really a spoiler of the movie if you haven't seen it, but there's a scene where Selena Kyle is talking and being really down on herself, and basically is telling Bruce that he views her as just like a pawn. He doesn't care what's gonna happen to her. He then lifts her head up by her chin, looks her in her eyes as if he's going to kiss her. So he was basically just checking her visual video contacts to see if they worked, and she was sitting there thirsting for a kiss. I audibly laughed, and there was a lot of moments like that in that film. But since there wasn't a lot of verbal humor and quick jokes, most critics walked away from the film saying things like there was a lack of humor and things like that. Let's take a look at another comic book movie that most people would put on that top tier list, if not at the top, The Dark Knight. A negative review from the Charleston City paper says, "It seems almost cruel to take a beloved child archetype and turn them into projections of adult angst." Basically saying it's too serious and too dark to be dealing with a childhood character like Batman. Another negative review of The Dark Knight from New Statesman, who is a top critic, says, "Too much psychology and not enough pop. It's possible to be too serious, you know." Everybody on this channel knows I'm a huge Batman fan, so I want to take a look at some films that aren't just Batman. So taking a look at a couple of reviews from the movie Logan, which is arguably one of the best comic book movies of all time, is very well received overall. Here's one from Film Frenzy, which I actually like a lot of their reviews. It's Stan Lee by the way of Cormac McCarthy, but basically No Country for Old X-Men. It suffers from its own sense of self-importance. That is a very snarky and comedic way of saying the film takes itself way too seriously. The tone, the subject matter, and everything in it is fairly serious. But what about the trailers for Logan made you think that you were gonna get something different from that? It wouldn't make sense for there to be a lot of quips and one-liners in a film like this. So as clearly captured by a few of those reviews, there are a lot of people that will die on the hill that superheroes are for kids, so therefore the movies should reflect that. And I would highly assume that those people have never read a piece of the source material that these movies are based off of, because the movies range from being pretty kid-friendly to ones that were made for teenagers. Kids can enjoy them. It's not going to be too much heavy substance in there, but it is a little bit edgier. It's going to have a little bit more layered adult subtext in it, but still enjoyable for a teen or kid audience. Then there's ones that no matter how you flip it, turn it, or reverse it, they're made for adults. So with that being said, the superhero movies and TV shows all reflect that. And if you disagree, let me know. But I personally feel like since the MCU movies are all made with everyone in mind, which sometimes helps the film and other times hurts it pretty bad, that it's really skewed people's perception on what these movies should be. And on top of that, a lot of these films fall into different genres. There's no real superhero genre. Logan is this like grand scale epic that's wrapping up a universe, and it deals with a young man who is not so young anymore, helping his aging mentor, with a lot of blood and a lot of gore and a lot of very adult underlying themes. The Batman is a detective noir film that follows the murderers of a deranged psychopath. These films simply just can't fall under that same formula of a movie like the MCU. If they were made to keep every single audience in mind, it would just simply take away from the viewing experience of the film. The Batman movie, it's not a kid's film. Logan, it's not a kid's film. I would even argue that a movie like Avengers Infinity War is not a kid's film. My advice to people that fall into that camp and get mad at movies or critique them because they don't have enough verbal comedy would be to go watch some other films outside of the realm of superheroes. Go watch some detective noir films. Go watch some old classic action flicks. Go watch some real spy thrillers like the old Bourne movies. Hell, even go watch some period pieces. Because although the MCU is the biggest thing in Hollywood right now, no doubt, the world of TV and film as a whole is just so much bigger. And look, I'm just a dude on the internet that likes talking about movies and TV shows that I love. So at the end of the day, my opinion doesn't really matter. View movies how you want to view movies. But I feel like if you go into every single film expecting it to follow the same structure and setup as an MCU movie, then you're missing out on the enjoyment of a lot of really great story. And in my personal opinion, you're watching films wrong.